Should be.
Okay.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a Chabura public shiur. Tonight we have with us our beloved Rosh Bet Midrash, Rabbi Joseph Dweck, for shiur on the upcoming Moed of Pesach. I'd also like to mention that last year our Chabura publishing house, Dot Press, published an insightful book on Pesach with a collection of essays serving as a perfect companion for the Moed. I highly recommend all to grab a copy, available on Amazon in time for the Chag. With that, thank you all for being here live. Thank you all who are going to be listening afterwards. And Rabbi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rav Ohad. You too are most beloved, and I very much appreciate your kind and warm words. And it's wonderful to be able to share with everybody tonight before Pesach on Pesach. So Rav Sina asked me, "Can I get a title for your talk?" And I just was not able to get him a proper title for my talk because things have been terribly busy lately, as they often are before Pesach. But what I will tell you now, what I am going to hopefully speak about. There is a peculiar issue with Rambam with regards to one of the major mitzvot of Pesach. There are two mitzvot on Pesach that we have that come from, or the night of Pesach, more accurately, that we have that come from the Torah, as opposed to the Hachamim, right? As opposed to mitzvot that have been established by the Hachamim. So practically everything that we do on the night of Pesach, outside of Eretz Yisrael, the entire second night itself is rabbinic. But everything that we do on the night of Pesach is rabbinic in origin, except for two mitzvot. So that means the karpas and the haroset and the maror and the 4 cups of wine and the Seder plate and the whole thing, all of it. It's all rabbinic. The Hachamim, for all intents and purposes, constructed the Seder for us, and Seder simply means order, right? So they've ordered the series of events for us. There are two mitzvot that the Torah maintains, or that we maintain from the Torah, are the eating of matzah and the telling of the story of Pesach. And Rambam counts these two mitzvot, as you would expect him to, in his Sefer HaMitzvot, right? He wrote a book on the mitzvot just to kind of enumerate and give some brief, a frame or outline onto each one of the mitzvot of the Torah. And he writes about the mitzvah of telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Now, what he also does, because Rambam, was very focused on the mitzvot, first of all, on counting the mitzvot, on understanding the mitzvot, and then on elaborating on the mitzvot. So Rambam elaborates on the various laws of each and every single one of the mitzvot of the Torah in his Mishneh Torah, right? In his review of the Torah that he calls it, right? The Mishneh Torah, which is his magnum opus, and deals with basically all of the laws of the Torah. So he presents the laws, he presents the commandments, more accurately, in the Sefer HaMitzvot, right, in the book on the mitzvot, and then he presents them again in much more detail in the Mishneh Torah. And what I'd like to look at with you tonight is how he presents the mitzvah in the Sefer HaMitzvot of telling the story, and how he presents the mitzvah of in the Mishneh Torah of telling the story. And there is a significant discrepancy. There are several discrepancies, but there is one significant discrepancy that I would like to look at and try and offer an insight as to why Rambam changed things around. Now, I'm going to say at the onset, this is my understanding of why Rambam changed things around. I am not saying that this is emphatically the reason. I don't know the reason emphatically, because Rambam didn't tell us the reason. He just did it. So that's what I'd like to do with you. I'd like to look at these the two places where he presents this and share some insights with it. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to present. This is going to be fairly textual, but not overwhelmingly, hopefully textual. And I'm going to present to you the first text that we will read, and that is the text from the Sefer HaMitzvot, and I'm hoping everybody can see this. Now, I'll also tell you another thing, which is annoying, but nonetheless, I just can't bear to do it. I did not have a tremendous amount of time to be able to prepare this source sheet. And what I always do whenever I'm bringing you something from the Sefer HaMitzvot, I always use Sefaria because it's easy. And whenever I bring you the Sefer HaMitzvot, I always reword. I type in the words, right, and change the words of the Sefer HaMitzvot as it's presented in Sefaria to Rav Kafech's translation. So I use the translation that's used in Sefaria, and I change it. I have not done that this time. So the text that you see in front of you is not Rav Kafech, but I'm going to read Rav Kafech, right? So it won't be exactly as it is that you see it here, but I wanted to have at least a placeholder so you know what it is that we're reading. And Rambam writes as follows in the translation of Rav Kafech on Mitzvah 157. Mitzvah 157, Hu hatzivui shenitztavinu lesaper b'tziat Mitzrayim belel hamisha asar b'Nisan. That is the commandment that we have to tell the story of the going out of Egypt on the 15th of Nisan, b'tchilat halayla, at the beginning of the night. That b'tchilat halayla, I'm going to point out the discrepancies before, as I'm reading here, before we get to the Mishneh Torah. That idea of b'tchilat halayla, at the beginning of the night, Rambam does not write in the Mishneh Torah. And he says that this needs to be done kefi tzahut l'shonam saper. It has to be done to the eloquence of the one speaking the story, right? So the one who speaks the story has to do it to his or her own level of eloquence. That too, Rambam does not write in the Mishneh Torah, but he mentions it here nonetheless. V'chol ma sheyosif b'dibur u'beti'ur hamatzav. The more that a person can speak on and describe the situation, b'hagdalat ma she'asu banu, in the great epic story of what they did to us, meaning the Egyptians, v'ha'avin she'asu, and the iniquity and the wrong that they caused us and did to us, HaMitzrim, the Egyptians, v'ha'ach nifra lanu Hashem mehem, and how God made them pay. Literally, nifra lanu means made them pay about what they did to us, over what is it they did to us. That too, all that I just read, well, not all, but the majority of what I just read about the bad things that the Egyptians did to us, and that's what we have to talk about, it's not present in the Mishneh Torah at all. All Rambam says that we should speak a great deal about it as much as we can. And we should thank him al kol ha'chesed, all the kindness asher gemalanu, that he gave to us. Harez mishubach. So the more that one is able to speak on all these things, the more praiseworthy the person is. As they said, the more that one is able to extend the story, the better. Now I want everybody to pay attention to this next line, because this next line is what I'm going to be dealing with in terms of our focus tonight. Hakatuv shene'emar lanu b'tzivui zeh, the pasuk that tells us this command, namely that we have to speak the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, hu omro yitaleh, it is in his saying, may he be exalted, meaning God's, v'higadta lebincha, and you shall tell your children. And that pasuk is a pasuk in Shemot, Perek Yod Gimal, pasuk Het. The extension of the pasuk, v'higadta lebincha bayom hahu le'emor ba'avur zeh asa Adonai li b'tzeti me'Mitzrayim. That pasuk is the pasuk that Rambam says is that commands us essentially to tell the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. You shall tell your children, v'higadta lebincha, on that day, bayom hahu le'emor ba'avur zeh, it is for the sake of this, meaning the Pesach and so on, the Korban Pesach and the Matzah Maror, asa Adonai li b'tzeti me'Mitzrayim, that God did for me when he took me out of Egypt. And the truth of the matter is, it's not shocking that that's the pasuk that Rambam brings. Practically all of the other Rishonim bring that pasuk as the pasuk that we learn the mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim from. Uba Perush. Now then he goes through, I'm going to skip a little bit, and he says that he explains how we know from that pasuk that we have to do it on the 15th of Nisan, and that we have to do it at night, and that it has to be done in that way. And then it goes down to the Mechilta. Right, so I don't know if you're following along, limping with me in this other text, but here in the text, Velashon Mechilta, right? So again, the words are not exactly the same because I'm reading from a different translation, but nonetheless, Velashon Mechilta, the language of the Mechilta of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Michilal shne'emar v'haya ki she'alecha bincha, asks a question. What questions does the Mechilta ask? It says, well, from the fact that it says, should your child ask you, this is what you say. I mean, could it be that the mitzvah is only when a child asks you that you tell the story, but if the child doesn't ask you, you don't tell the story? No, no. You have to tell the story even if the child doesn't ask you. Talmud lomar v'gatal bincha af al pi shelo shalcha. Rather, it says in the pasuk, you must tell your child, even if your child does not ask you. And that happens to be the pasuk that we use for the she'eno yodea lish'ol in the Haggadah. Now they ask another question. En li ela bizman sheyesh lo ben. Well, okay, I mean that's all fine and well, even if he doesn't ask you that you tell your child without question. What if you don't have a child to tell? Well, does that mean that I'm exempt now from telling the story? And the Mechilta answers, Talmud lomar v'gatal demcha en li ela bazman sheyesh lo ben beno leben atzmo beno ben lebeno le'acherim. Right? Well, no. What if I'm sitting by myself and I have to do the Seder like some people had to do during COVID, or some people get stuck? One time, person was coming back from during 9/11. I remember one person was it wasn't 9/11. There was something else going on. I don't remember, but flights were restricted. Oh, no, it was 9/11, but I'm mixing up Rosh Hashanah with Pesach. That's a whole nother issue. But in any case, if a person finds themselves stranded, right, they're not able to get home properly, have to do a Seder by themselves for whatever reason. There could be many reasons why a person might do a Seder by themselves, or a person is sitting amongst friends and not with children. Does that mean that they're exempt? No. How do I know that? Because it says, Talmud lomar vayomer Moshe el ha'am zachor et hayom hazeh. Moshe said to the people, Zachor et hayom hazeh. Remember this day. Well, how does that tell me that I'm supposed to tell the story? It says Rambam, Kilomar, in other words, Shehu tzival lezochro, kemo she'amar zachor et yom ha'shabbat lekadesho. There the pasuk is telling us to remember it in the same way the pasuk told us remember Shabbat. How did it tell us to remember Shabbat? Zachor Yom HaShabbat. Remember Shabbat. Remember Shabbat doesn't mean recall it after forgetting it. It means bring it to the forefront of your mind. How do I bring it to the forefront of my mind? I speak it. And that, of course, is the mitzvah of Kiddush, that we have to say Kiddush on Leil Shabbat to fulfill the mitzvah of Zachor. Et Yom HaShabbat the Kadeshon, Rambam says, to fulfill the mitzvah of Zachor et Yom HaZeh Asher Asetem Mitzrayim, you must speak it. And so we learn from that caveat pasuk, as is brought here in the Sefer HaMitzvot, that even if you don't have kids, you need to tell the story to yourself or amongst the friends that you sit with. So I want to recognize one major thing that Rambam is doing over here, right? Just to be clear, Rambam brings the pasuk for the core command of the mitzvah, right? In other words, the mitzvah itself gets off the ground. It is created by which pasuk? There is a deen in the pasuk that tells me that even if I'm not talking to the kids, which is assumed is the ubiquitous or normal way to do it, I still have an obligation to do it. And that is how? How do I know that? Because there's another pasuk that says, you must be conscious of this day through speaking the nature of this day on the night of that you were taken out of Egypt. So the Zachor at the Yom HaZeh Yisrael is a caveat, or it is a detail of that overarching mitzvah of telling your children the story of Mitzrayim. Oh, you don't have a kid to tell, so then you say it anyway because of Zachor at the Yom HaZeh Yisrael. Do I have you? Are you following? Right? I can't see you if you're shaking your heads. Yes, let me see. Have I got you? Are you following? Nobody's heads are showing except for one. Thank you, Neil. All right, very good. So understanding that, I want to now look at the Mishneh Torah. And you would expect that the Mishneh Torah should, for all intents and purposes, mirror, or at least, copy the Sefer HaMitzvot and its structure more or less, except that it doesn't. It is almost the inverse of what it is that's presented in the Sefer HaMitzvot. So let's have a look. First of all, I'll just show you the Mechilta, right? Before we get into the Mishneh Torah, the actual Mechilta that the Rambam is learning from. And interesting, the Mechilta starts off with the pasuk of Zachor, right? Vayomer Moshe la'am Zachor et hayom hazeh asher stem Mitzrayim. Now it says, the Mechilta question says, V'hayakish alecha mincha mahar lemor. It says that should your child ask you tomorrow, right? So it brings a pasuk in which there is a recognition of a child actually asking. Based on that pasuk, the Mechilta asks, Yachol im sha'alcha tamagid lo v'im la ve'atamagid lo. Well, could it be that it's only when the child asks that you say that you have a commandment to respond? Or is there a need for you to initiate the conversation to your child? Talmud lomar v'higadta lebincha. Well, we still have a pasuk that says v'higadta lebincha, you must tell your child without question, and therefore afa pi shelo she'alcha, even though the child didn't ask you. Now, interesting, where's the whole discussion of the Mechilta begin? With v'chish alecha bincha. A whole different pasuk, right? Should your son ask you, which is in pasuk Yodalet in Perek Yud Gimel. Then it answers it with pasuk Het in Perek Yud Gimel. Okay, all right. Then it continues, says En li ela bizman sheyesh lo ben. Okay, great. All of those pasukim, the questioning or the not questioning, the telling without the questioning, all is assuming that there is kids there that I can speak to. But what about bizman sheyesh lo ben, beno leben atzmo, if you're sitting by yourself, beno leben achirim, or you're sitting with friends and other people that are not your kids, minayin? How do I know that I have an obligation to be able to say it? Talmud lomar, we learn from another pasuk, that pasuk, a third pasuk, the Zachor pasuk. That's how I know. So this is the Mechilta that Rambam bases everything on. But in the Sefer HaMitzvot, you see that he uses the V'higadta lebincha as the base pasuk, and the Zachor Tasher Yom Hazeh Shtem Mitzrayim as the development pasuk of the specific deen to the mitzvah of not having kids to talk to. Look what he does in the Mishneh Torah. Mitzvah Aseh, he says, there is a positive commandment in the Torah, L'saper b'nisim neflaot shena'asu l'avotenu b'Mitzrayim, to speak of the miracles that were done to our forefathers in Egypt. Notice he doesn't say anything at all about the bad things that the Egyptians did to us. Well, again, that's not for tonight. Belel Hamisha Asar is supposed to be done on the 15th of Nisan, Shnei Emar, as it says in the Pasuk, and here's the drum roll, please, the Pasuk, the core Pasuk that we learned the mitzvah from, Zachor et hayom hazeh asher satem b'Mitzrayim. In the Mishneh Torah, Rambam learns the core mitzvah from that Pasuk. Kemo Shnei Emar, and he says, just as it says, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, remember the day of Shabbat. And then he says, well, there's a caveat. Uminayin shebel hamisha asar. How do we know it has to be done on the 15th? Well, that we learn from V'higadta lebincha bayom hahu, right? We learn from V'higadta on that day, it says in that pasuk. And then another thing we learn from V'higadta lebincha, which is what? Afal pi she'en lo ben, afilu hachamim gedulim. Excuse me, here it says, even though he doesn't have a child, he has to do it. And then the next one, next halakha here, he adds this, he waits till the next halakha and adds it. Mitzvah lehodia labanim. There's a mitzvah to tell this to children as well. Afilu lo sha'alu, even though Yashine'emar v'higadta lebincha, as it says, you should tell your children. So what does he do here? He flips it. He flips it. He takes the mitzvah, right? So the pasuk that is the core pasuk that gives me the nature of the mitzvah itself is no longer V'higadta lebincha in the Mishneh Torah. It's now Zachor et hayom hazeh asher satem Mitzrayim. And the development of that pasuk, or the detail of that pasuk, which essentially is, oh, you should also tell it to kids, is an extension of that original mitzvah, and we learn that from V'higadta lebincha. But V'higadta lebincha is not the pasuk of the mitzvah. It's a pasuk that tells me a detail of the mitzvah. Whereas in the Sefer HaMitzvot, the pasuk of the mitzvah is V'higadta lebincha, that you have to tell your kids. The pasuk of the detail of the mitzvah that you have to tell even if you don't have kids is Zachor et hayom hazeh asher satem Mitzrayim. Why did Rambam change? Why did he shift? Why did he switch it around and use the main pasuk as Zachor et hayom hazeh asher satem Mitzrayim rather than V'higadta lebincha bayom ha'u? So that's what I want to suggest for you tonight in the 35 minutes that we have left. And I think that it is substantial because what you will find is that it really is the Zachor Hayom Hazeh Asher Setem Mitzrayim really is the cornerstone of the entirety of this mitzvah of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, not just Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, the entire night of Leil Pesach. So I want to go back to look at something that Rambam says over here, right? When he presents it, both here and in the Sefer HaMitzvot, and he brings this pasuk. He says, this pasuk tells me, Zachor Hayom Hazeh Asher Setem Mitzrayim, tells me that I have to tell the story regardless. So the first simple thing is that Rambam is thinking, I'm imagining, right, that Rambam thinks, look, I have one pasuk that tells me I have to tell the story regardless. And that's the reality. In other words, the mitzvah of telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is not a mitzvah to tell your children. It's a mitzvah to tell the story. There is an element of the mitzvah that if there are children there, you also have a mitzvah, not a separate, not a 614th mitzvah, right? It's not a separate mitzvah. It is an element, a deen, in the mitzvah of telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim that if there are children there, I need to tell them. But that's not the core of the mitzvah. The core of the mitzvah is simply that I have to tell the story. How do I learn that I have to tell the story? Zachor Hayom Hazeh Asher Setem Mitzrayim. Then Rambam says this peculiar thing. He says, Kemo Zachor Yom HaShabbat. Exactly the same as Zachor Yom HaShabbat. Now, the very simple meaning of that is what? I'm sorry, I didn't share the thing with you. But the very simple meaning of that is what? Simple meaning of that is in the same way that I know that Zachor Yom HaShabbat is Kiddush. Nobody argues with that, right? Everybody recognizes the mitzvah of Zachor Yom Shabbat is a mitzvah of Kiddush. It's a mitzvah of speaking out that it is Shabbat today. In the same way that the Torah tells me to speak out that it's Shabbat today by saying, recognize it, Zachor, when it tells me Zachor Yom Hazeh Asher Yasatem Mitzrayim, it's telling me recognize the going out of Egypt. How do I recognize it? Speak it. Just like Zachor Yom Shabbat. Well, that's a simple point, but I think that there's a deeper point. The deeper point is, Zachor Yom HaShabbat is indeed the mitzvah of Kiddush. But Rambam holds that the mitzvah of Kiddush really is double-sided. That the mitzvah of the Torah is not just the mitzvah of Kiddush, although there are some differences of opinions with regards to Rambam's opinion over here, but nonetheless, I'll tell you why it doesn't matter. Rambam holds that Havdalah on Motzei Shabbat is also the mitzvah of Zachor Yom HaShabbat Kaddish. And if you think about it, the mitzvah of Kiddush and the mitzvah of Havdalah are the same thing. What am I doing when I say Kiddush of Shabbat? I am recognizing that it is now Shabbat as opposed to Chol, the mundane weekday. I'm recognizing that it is no longer the weekday, it is now Shabbat. And I'm differentiating when I say Kiddush between the day of Shabbat and the day that is not Shabbat. Just as with Havdalah, I'm differentiating between Shabbat and not Shabbat. And in Havdalah, because it is Havdalah in its nature, I'm also differentiating between Israel and the other nations. And what I'm suggesting is that the Zachor et Yom HaShabbat that Rambam brings here is signaling the Zachor et Yom Hazeh Asher Setem Mitzrayim, that the nature of the speaking of it is specifically in the contrast of it. In other words, the core element of the telling of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim requires contrast. Another way of saying that, it requires Havdalah. It requires differentiation. That is the core mitzvah, not the telling of to the children. As a matter of fact, we're going to see in a moment that the telling to the children itself needs to be done in contrast. And that if I am not mavdil, if I am not contrasting in my story, and in a moment we will see with what we need to contrast, right? What are the elements of contrast? If I'm not contrasting in my story, I have not fulfilled the mitzvah of telling the story. So while Rambam, remember that Rambam wrote the Sefer HaMitzvot first. While Harambam is towing the line of pretty much everyone else in his writing of the Sefer HaMitzvot and saying, V'higadta lebincha is the pasuk that we learn the mitzvah from, he thinks about this. And he decides that by the time that he writes the Mishneh Torah, he's going to rely on the fact that the Mechilta used 3 different pisukim to present 3 different aspects of the mitzvah, and he's going to rest the foundational pasuk as Zachor Yom Hazeh She'aseh Mitzrayim rather than V'higadta lebincha, and he's going to now use V'higadta lebincha as a development of the mitzvah, a deen in the mitzvah, not the core commandment itself. And rather, the core commandment will be Zachor Yom Hazeh She'aseh Mitzrayim, which makes perfect sense, really, when you think about it, because the Zachor Yom Hazeh She'aseh Mitzrayim doesn't have caveats. It simply tells you must remember this day. How do you remember the day? Like Yom HaShabbat, Zachor. You speak this day. But it's not just Zachor Yom HaShabbat, you speak it in the same way you speak Shabbat. It's you speak it and come aware of it in the recognition of contrast in the same way of Zachor Yom HaShabbat, which is essentially Havdalah or Kiddush, whatever side of the coin you want, but either way it's Havdalah. And what I'm suggesting further is, the very nature of Zachor is contrast. In other words, how do we become aware of anything? The way that we become aware of anything, of what something is to know what it isn't. You never know what something is if you don't know what it isn't. For all intents and purposes, if you need to define something, you need to define what it is by recognizing what it isn't. And if you can't do that, you don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, you don't really know what it is. So if there's a mitzvah of Zachor, et Yom Hazeh She'aseh Mitzrayim, know this day, be aware of this day, which essentially what Zachor means. The only way to be aware of this day is to be able to be aware of the contrasting elements that define this day. What is this day? It's the day Asher Yetzatem Mitzrayim. It's the day you came out of Egypt. And you had an existential change in your very context of life. You came out of where? Egypt. What is Egypt? It's a house of slavery. Bet Avadim. And what does it mean to come out of Egypt? It means to come out of slavery. What am I if I've come out? Well, you're free if you come out of slavery. And that we need to know is the difference. I also need to tell that to the kids. But that is a deen in the mitzvah, not the mitzvah. I want to show you how substantial this is. Because notice what Rambam says here is part of the nature of the mitzvah. This is a Mishnah Mefureshet, really, what Rambam brings. And he says, where am I? Okay. I have to find it. Oh, I didn't put it on here, did I? Okay, yeah, I didn't put it on here. So Rambam writes, he's posek the deen of the Mishnah and the Gemara. He says, how does the story have to be told? It says, Sarich le'atchil bignut ulsayem b'shevach. You have to start the story with negative aspects and complete the story with positive aspects. That's a Mishnah Mefureshet, which means that the story must be told behavdalah, right? In other words, the story must be told in contrast. You have to begin with the negatives and end with the positives. There's a discussion in the Gemara between Rav and Shmuel. What exactly are the negatives and what exactly are the positives? So there's an argument. One says that the negatives are the physical slavery of Avadim Hayinu Lefaro b'Mitzrayim and the physical freedom of Vayotzienu Adonai Eloheinu Misham, that God took us out of there. Another opinion is the mental, spiritual slavery of Mitahila of Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu. We used to be idol worshippers. And the spiritual freedom of Kiravanu Hamakom LaAvodato. The HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought us close to his Avodah by giving us the Torah. How are we posek? Like both. And we have to say both. But both are what? Havdalah. They're both contrasts. And the reason it needs to be done that way is because if I'm going to be free, I need to be able to know the difference of one state and the other. I need to be able to know the difference between one choice and the other. I need to be able to know the difference between the consequence number one and consequence number two. And if I can't know that, I'm not free because I have no conscious awareness of the nature of my reality. And if you do not have conscious awareness of the nature of your reality, you cannot be free. And the truth of the matter is that the slaves in Egypt had nothing made a difference. Because at the end of the day, they were owned by Paro, did the will of Paro. All that made a difference was what Paro wanted, not what they wanted, nor what they thought, nor how they believed. So that's one thing, right? Embedded in the mitzvah of the telling the story itself is the contrast of genut and shebach, negative and positive storytelling, right? So I have to start with negatives and contrast them with the positives. Not only that, Rambam writes here as a halacha in the Leil HaSeder itself, not just in the story, in the behavior on the Leil HaSeder. Tzarich la'asot shinui b'layla hazeh. You have to do things differently on that night than you normally do any other night of the year. Differently, yeah, well, you got to make changes. There has to be contrast. Differences. Differences like what? Well, havdalot. You have to be mavdil between that night and every other night. Why do I have to make differences? Well, I mean, I want to prompt questioning. I want people to recognize that things are not like they're normally supposed to be, right? There's something strange. It's different here. And what is the awareness of difference prompt? Questions. And what do questions elicit? Conscious awareness and understanding. So the entire impetus for the questioning, for the coming to an awareness of what it means to be free is kicked off by these differences that are done, that create contrasts, that elicit questioning. You have to do different things on that night. Why? So that the kids should see that you're doing strange, different things and prompt questions, and they should question you. What should they ask you? What changed tonight? Which is really what manishtana means. Simple Hebrew. Manishtana. What changed on this night from all the other nights? And the truth of the matter is, we always talk about the 4 questions. There are not 4 questions. There's only one question. And that question is manishtana. The other 4 parts of it are the reasons why I'm asking the question, which are simply awarenesses of difference. Other nights I eat chametz and matzah. There's no hakpada. I could eat whatever I want. Tonight we can only eat matzah. Something weird and different about that. And so on and so forth. Those are just 4 reasons as to why I'm asking the one question. And the one question is manishtana. What changed? It's all about havdalah. And for all intents and purposes, kiddush. To recognize the sanctification of this particular night. This Leil Shimurim. The night Asher Yatzatem Me'eretz Mitzrayim. And so important is it that I ask questions of difference, that even if I am sitting by myself for the Seder, I have to tell the story not only in contrast of negative to positive, I actually have to ask the questions to myself to bring my awareness to the need to answer those questions, which come from an awareness of contrast. And therefore, I think it is remarkable, absolutely remarkable, that Rambam adjusted this mitzvah as he presents it in the Mishneh Torah, in contrast, as it were, to the way that he presents it in the Sefer HaMitzvot. In the Sefer HaMitzvot, He toes the line like all the other Rishonim and learns it from Higata de Bincha. In the Mishneh Torah, he's the only one that learns it from that pasuk. And it is so absolutely beautiful and so clear. Why it should, of course, be that pasuk, like Zachor Yom HaShabbat Lekadesho. And I'm telling you, the Vigad, I told you before, the Vigad Tali Bincha must be done in the form of Zachor, understanding as we have that Zachor is essentially Havdalah. Because look what the Rambam does here, right? I've mentioned this many times. The Rambam presents a halacha that practically nobody keeps. He says, how, when you are telling the youngest child that is able to understand the most basic things, what are you telling them exactly? The story? Are you sitting and telling them once upon a time there was a big bad Paro that got all of the Jews in slavery? No, absolutely not. You're not doing that. The Rambam says you're not allowed to do that to a little child. What do you tell a little child? If he was young or not particularly intelligent, Omerlo, you say to him, Beni, my son, Kulanu hainu avadim, we were all slaves. It doesn't even say lefaro b'mitzrayim. We just have to say we were all slaves. In those days, there were slaves in the house, so you could point to a slave and say, like this slave. But there had to be some explanation of what slave means. And on this night, HaKadosh Baruch Hu redeemed us. It says that we were in Mitzrayim. Kadosh Baruch Hu freed us. He brought us out into freedom. That is all you tell the child. You do not tell the child Moshe Rabbeinu and Dam Sfardei Akinim Arov. You don't tell him about Paro. You don't tell him about the negotiations back and forth with Kadosh Baruch Hu Paro. You don't tell him any of that. All the child needs to know is one basic, fundamental, contrasting idea: slavery, freedom. Then Rambam says, if the ben was hacham, was gadol or hacham, he was older or particularly very intelligent young child, then you tell him what happened in Mitzrayim. Why can you only tell him what happened in Mitzrayim then? Because only then will he understand what happened in Mitzrayim in terms of slavery and freedom. And it is very easy to misunderstand the story if you don't understand that I'm listening to a story about slavery and freedom. Everything is in the Zachor. And the Zachor is conscious awareness. And the conscious awareness only comes through the capacity for the sensitivities to Havdalah. And this is why I want you to hear this very important. You can recognize the level of a person's conscious awareness, and for that matter, intelligence about what's going on in the world around them, to the degree that they are sensitive to nuance. Because Havdalah is not just stark slavery freedom. The more subtle and the more sensitive and the more refined the differences are, and a person can be aware of, the more consciously aware that person is. So you listen to people on the right or the left of any group, right? Social right, social left, political right, political left, religious right, religious left. Very rarely are you listening to nuance. You are listening to stark this or that, black or white. Well, that's very nice for a little child who's 5 years old. But if you are an adult and still speaking and thinking like a child who's 5 years old and incapable of being able to deal with the nuances of what is going on in the world around you, which is utterly complex, without question, not only are you not fully aware and conscious, not only are you not on the level of intelligence that is expected, you are also not free to the level that you can't be sensitive to it. And that is something to keep in mind. If you speak to someone who only thinks in terms of black and white, who can only speak in terms of black and white, beware that you are talking to a child, no matter how old they may look. Or you are talking to somebody who simply has not developed their conscious awareness or their intelligence. No matter how old and aware and intelligent they may look, or for that matter, sound. People can sound intelligent by using many, many words and saying a great deal of nothing with what it is that they say, because they don't really present the nuanced differences in their rhetoric as is necessary. And that is very important. I cannot stress that enough. And that has everything to do with Pesach. And that's one of the reasons why I believe Rambam presents here, Zachor et hayom hazeh, be aware of this day through the speaking of this day. And it's another point, right? It's possible for a person to be consciously aware of the nuances, which is a very wonderful level to reach, but can't speak the nuances. There's a very big difference between being able to understand them, to know them, and to be able to then speak them, to articulate them. That's a whole nother level. And the exercise on Pesach, year after year, is to come to greater and greater levels, not just of details of that's why, by the way, the more detail that you can provide to the story, essentially, the more nuance that you can provide to the story, hareze meshubah. Kol hamarbe lesaper. And Rambam writes, what does it mean, hamarbe lesaper? It doesn't mean how much time you can sit at the Seder table. It means how much detail can you give the story? How much depth and breadth and specificity can you give to the aspects of the story? The more you can do that, hareze meshubah. That is praiseworthy. And that is our endeavor year after year to grow and develop and be able to do it more and more and come on to things that we never realized before, to come to conscious awareness of things that we never realized before. That's Pesach. And that's what it's meant to be. And that's the Zachor et hayom hazeh asher asetem b'Mitzrayim that Rambam in the Mishneh Torah brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly sets as the core pasuk of the mitzvah itself. And the last thing that I want to say is this, and then I'll open for questions. The Haggadah set out so exquisitely. Before we begin the Hallel on Pesach night, look at what it is that we say, right? So we recognize that we have this requirement of Hallel. What does Hallel come from? Of course, Hallel comes from conscious awareness, right? I mean, in other words, if I am not aware of what it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done for me, and I am not aware of the detail that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done this for me. And look what we do in the Seder in order to be able to come to this, right? The whole Dayenu section. What do we say? Al ahad kama v'chama, right? How many levels, right? Kama ma'alot. How many degrees of response did HaKadosh Baruch Hu give me? How many degrees of attention did HaKadosh Baruch Hu give me? How many degrees of care and love did HaKadosh Baruch Hu give me? Kama ma'alot tovot lamakom aleinu. אילו הוציאנו ממצרים ולא עשה בהם שבטים, אילו עשה בשבטים ולא עשה בהוליהם, אילו עשה בהוליהם ולא עשה בחוריהם. And so we go through every detail, every single detail. And we go through that, and then we count the makot, and we go, how many aspects? Now maybe there was 4 aspects to the makah. So if there were 4 aspects of Makkah, Ivra, Vizam, Sarah, Mishla'am, Malchir, and we start counting and recognizing the multitudinal aspects of these things that are no way black and white. What is Ivra? What is Zam? What is Sarah? Those sound like synonyms. What's the difference between Ivra and Zam and Sarah and Mishla'am, Malchir? Well, I don't know. Let's figure it out. So of course, Rabban Gamliel and his friends were sitting up till all hours of the night dealing with this stuff. So when we realize that our conscious awareness is in high definition, vivid HD, as a result of this sensitivity to the mass nuances and the complexity that is in all of this, to the degree that we are capable, and that's why I think Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvot says, Kifit tzahut lashon, to the level of your eloquence, which means Not which expensive words can you find. How clear and detailed can you be in your speaking of the story? When you are able to do that and come to broad HD, crystal clear, crisp awareness of the unbelievable nature of what it is that our people have experienced from the Hasadim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is only one thing that you are completely moved to do. Hallel. It's praise. So look how we open the Hallel on Pesach night at the Seder. We say lefichach. After all that's been said and done, right? We've gone through the whole Haggadah. We say lefichach anachnu hayavim. We are obligated. I mean, we can't imagine anything else. Lehodot. And again, look how many different words for praise we use. Lehodot, lehalel, leshabeach, lefaer, leromem, lehader, ulkales. And each and every single one of those words means something else. To the one who did for our forefathers and for us all of these wonders and miracles. And then look what we do. We contrast back, forth, back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. And from that awareness of those back and forth contrasts, those juxtapositions, those nuanced differences of all of these various elements that are running in this story, hallelujah. The only thing that a person can say, if they are genuinely consciously aware of what it is that they are saying and becoming aware of, is hallelujah. And so you raise your glass for that. And you say a full hallel with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your consciousness. And how does one go through a Leil Seder and not break down in tears of joy and gratitude before Kadosh Baruch Hu Ishtabach Shemo La'ad, and the great merit that it is to be Am Yisrael in this world. So with that, I wish you all a Chag Sameach and Shetisku Lecherut V'Geula. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer for a few minutes.
If you have any questions, you can raise your hand or unmute or write in the chat box. We have a question. Oh, what was the time difference between the Sefer Mitzvot and the Mishneh Torah?
I don't know. It wasn't a huge amount of time because Rambam wrote the Sefer Mitzvot after the Purusha Mishnah. So he was in his late 30s because he wrote the Mishneh Torah in his 40s, over about 10 years. So it wasn't a long time. The Sefer Mitzvot was like the precursor to the Mishneh Torah. Not a long time.
Eli?
Hi, Rav, thank you. When you're saying Havdalah Motzei Shabbat, how long can you say it? An hour after, half an hour after? Is there a time frame?
You have all night to say it. You have until Tuesday to say Havdalah.
Okay. Thank you.
Can you tie in the elements of Rosh Hashanah when we speak of Yom Zikaron, of bringing together the elements of our life? Over here, there's an element of the differentiation. Can we tie
There
that?
is also an element on Rosh Hashanah, of course, with regards to that, but it comes out as a process of the of the connecting of all of the elements of the life. Because what ends up happening is you start to see your life emerge and you realize the parts that are not your life. And that's why Rosh Hashanah is the first day of the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah. Right? There's no real Teshuvah in just weaving your life together. The element of Teshuvah comes from the awareness of the fact that this is not my life, or not the life that I want, or the life that I wish to choose, which you must choose on Rosh Hashanah. And how are you to choose if you don't know your choices, or you don't know the differences between what one life might be, or where the trajectory of one path might lead? Right? So it all comes to that, I believe, but which I think is essentially every Zachor in some way or another. That's a good question.
And are you suggesting that he's in the Mishneh Torah, we're seeing a more developed presentation, or was there a
Yes.
specific?
I'm suggesting it's more developed presentation. I don't know. Look, I didn't ask Rambam. I wish I could, but I think that Rambam. Look, you could say one of two things. You could say that Rambam chose to present it from a different angle, right, in the Mishneh Torah, in the way that he wanted to present the halachot. That's possible. But I think, and I don't think it takes away from Rambam at all. I mean, for me, to the contrary, it meant that Rambam was constantly thinking, right, about how to. He does the same thing with regards to the Ikarim, right, the Yesodot. When he writes the Yesodot in Perek Chelek, he opens it with Hakadosh Baruch Hu's existence, and develops it into Hakadosh Baruch Hu's primal nature, right? The fact that Hakadosh Hu is kadmon, right? That's as a matter of fact the fourth thing. When he presents it in the Mishneh Torah, he says, "Yesod Yesodot Ramon Shmuel Leda Sheyesh Matzui Rishon," and he starts with that and comes down. And of course, it's a massive shift to be able to do that, because once you say that he's Rishon, everything else falls into place. Even the Yehud falls into place. So he shifts it. Right, I don't think it's taking away in any way, shape, or form from Rambam to say that, you know what, he was 20-something years old when he wrote the Perek Chelek. He was thinking, must have spoken it out several times before, came to an awareness, something, it's better to present it this way. And I think that's what happened here. I think that's what he did here. And it's just, absolutely elegantly beautiful. I mean, it just completely runs. It's completely understandable that Rambam initially kind of took, of course, the way that the Rif looked at it and the way that all the other Rishonim look at it, and essentially how it seems to be presented in the Talmud, and then stopped and said, well, there's a Mechilta, not necessarily. Like we should present it this way, and this is this way it's done. So I think that's part of his greatness, actually. I think, yeah. I had a conversation about this briefly with Rabbi Faur's grandson a few years ago, and where he said, he notices certain rabbis, his grandfather, Rabbi Faur also, there's certain rabbis, you listen to their very old stuff, they've changed their mind over the years. And I said to me, that is not a diminishment of the Hacham. That is a great praise of the Hacham, because it means A, the Hacham is thinking, and B, is not embarrassed to say, something, I changed my mind. This is a better way to look at it than that, right? Or even I was wrong. This is more correct. I don't think that Rambam was in any way saying I was wrong in one or the other. I simply think that he recognized that the presentation here was much more significant, and that there's no reason why not to learn the mitzvah from that pasuk, especially when there's a makor in Hazal, to see that they're learning from that pasuk, the core element of the mitzvah. Okay, Adkan. Very good.
Thank you so much, Chacham.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.